Have you ever looked back at a moment in your life and thought, I knew better, I felt it in my gut, so why did I ignore it? If you're a super empath, that memory doesn't fade, it echoes. Because the deepest pain isn't always what others did to you, it's the moment you quietly abandoned your own truth just to keep someone else comfortable. Carl Jung believed that when we silence our inner voice, we disconnect from the most powerful part of ourselves, and that fracture can shape our relationships, our confidence, even our identity. In this video, we're uncovering the one emotional mistake super empaths almost never forgive, the hidden psychological reason it hurts so deeply, and the powerful shift that finally sets you free. You might recognize yourself in ways you weren't expecting, and what you hear near the end could change how you see your past forever. So stay with me until the last minute, because the final insight is the one most empaths wish they had learned sooner. And if this speaks to your heart, don't just watch silently, subscribe for more deep, honest psychology, and leave a comment saying, I'm ready, so you can begin this journey with intention. The most painful truth for many super empaths is not that they trusted the wrong people, but that at some point they chose to silence their own inner voice in order to keep someone else comfortable. And that quiet self-betrayal leaves a deeper scar than any external betrayal ever could. This is what Carl Jung was pointing toward when he warned that suppressing our authentic emotions fractures the psyche. Because when you repeatedly ignore what you feel, what you need, and what your intuition is clearly signaling, you begin to separate from yourself, almost as if you are living life from a distance rather than from within your own center. Super empaths are especially vulnerable to this because they are deeply attuned to the emotional states of others. They sense discomfort, tension, sadness, and unspoken needs almost instantly. And instead of honoring their own feelings, they often shift their behavior to soothe the emotional atmosphere around them. They say yes when their body says no. They stay quiet when something inside them wants to speak. They rationalize red flags because they understand the other person's pain, and they convince themselves that being patient, forgiving, and endlessly understanding is a form of love. At first, this may even feel noble, as though they are being the bigger person, the emotionally mature one, the safe place for others. But slowly, something inside begins to ache, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. There is a subtle exhaustion that comes from constantly adjusting to others while neglecting the self, and over time, that exhaustion turns into resentment, confusion, and a quiet grief that is difficult to explain. Jung believed that every time we deny a genuine emotion, we push a part of ourselves into the unconscious, where it does not disappear but instead gathers weight, waiting to be acknowledged. This is why self-abandonment becomes an invisible wound. It is not always tied to one dramatic event, but to a long series of small moments where the empath chose harmony over honesty, connection over authenticity, acceptance over self-respect. They might look back and realize they stayed in relationships that felt wrong from the beginning, tolerated behavior that hurt them because they didn't want to hurt anyone else, or kept giving emotional energy long after they felt depleted, all because they believed their role was to understand, to heal, to hold space. The tragedy is that many empaths do not notice the damage while it is happening. They only begin to feel it when something breaks, when the relationship ends, when the burnout becomes too heavy, or when they suddenly feel disconnected from themselves and wonder how they got there. That moment of awareness can be painful because it brings a haunting realization. I knew. I felt it. I sensed the truth all along, but I chose not to listen. This is the part that super empaths find hardest to forgive, not because they are weak, but because their emotional intelligence is so high that they recognize the depth of what was lost each time they ignored their inner voice. Jung would describe this as a loss of wholeness, a disruption in the process of becoming who you truly are. When you consistently betray your own emotional truth, you begin to build a life that reflects other people's needs rather than your own essence, and eventually that life feels unfamiliar, even suffocating. Yet within this painful realization also lies the beginning of transformation. The moment an empath truly sees the pattern of self-abandonment, not with shame but with honesty, something shifts. They begin to understand that their sensitivity was never the problem. The problem was using that sensitivity only outwardly and not inwardly. They start to see that empathy without self-empathy is self-erasure, and that true emotional strength does not come from endlessly accommodating others, but from honoring the quiet wisdom inside. This awareness can be uncomfortable, even destabilizing, because it challenges old identities like the one who always understands, or the one who never complains. But it is also deeply liberating. It opens the door to a new way of being where the empath still cares deeply, still feels profoundly, but no longer at the cost of their own inner truth. Jung believed that healing begins when we reclaim the parts of ourselves we have disowned, and for the super empath, this means learning to trust their intuition again, to take their emotions seriously, and to recognize that preserving the self is not selfish, it is essential. Over time, as this shift takes root, the invisible wound of self-abandonment begins to soften, not because the past disappears, but because the empath is no longer repeating the same emotional mistake. They begin to build relationships that feel reciprocal rather than draining, choices that feel aligned rather than forced, and a life that reflects who they are rather than who they thought they had to be. And in that process, what once felt like an unforgivable inner betrayal slowly becomes something else entirely. A powerful turning point, a moment of awakening, and the beginning of a deeper, more honest relationship with the self. Many super empaths grow up learning, often without realizing it, that their emotional safety depends on how well they can adapt to the needs of others, and this is where Carl Jung's idea of the persona becomes painfully relevant. Jung described the persona as the social mask we wear to function in the world, the version of ourselves we present so that we are accepted, liked, and understood. And while everyone uses a persona to some degree, empaths tend to build theirs around being endlessly kind, emotionally available, patient, and strong. Over time, this mask becomes so polished and so automatic that it no longer feels like something they are choosing. It begins to feel like who they are supposed to be. They become the listener everyone relies on, the calm presence in every crisis, the one who never complains, the one who always understands, even when their own heart is heavy. At first, this role can feel meaningful, even fulfilling, because it brings appreciation and connection. But slowly, quietly, the emotional cost begins to rise. There is a subtle tension that develops when your outer behavior no longer matches your inner truth, when you smile while feeling drained, when you offer comfort while needing comfort yourself, when you say, "I'm fine," because it feels safer than admitting you are not. Jung warned that when the persona becomes too rigid, it separates us from the authentic self. And for empaths, this separation can be especially painful because they are so emotionally aware yet feel unable to express their own reality. The exhaustion that follows is not just physical or mental, it is existential. It is the fatigue of constantly performing emotional stability while quietly unraveling inside, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who feel close to you but do not actually know you. Many empaths eventually reach a moment where they realize that others love the version of them that is always supportive, always calm, always accommodating, but they have never truly been seen in their vulnerability, their anger, their confusion, or their unmet needs. That realization can cut deeply because it raises an uncomfortable question. If I stop being this version of myself, will anyone still stay? This is where the pain of the persona trap truly emerges, not just from being tired, but from the fear that authenticity might lead to rejection. Empaths often keep the mask in place because they believe it protects their relationships, But what it actually protects is the comfort of others, not the well-being of the self. Over time, this creates an inner split, where one part of the empath continues to perform emotional strength while another part grows increasingly unheard and unseen. Jung believed that the psyche seeks wholeness, and when we deny parts of ourselves for too long, they begin to surface through anxiety, burnout, emotional numbness, or a sense of emptiness that seems to have no clear cause. This is why so many empaths feel suddenly disconnected from their own joy, creativity, and sense of identity, even though from the outside they appear caring and composed. The painful truth is that when people respond primarily to the persona, they are responding to a role, not to the real person behind it, and this is why empaths often feel unfulfilled even in relationships where they are valued. They are valued for their usefulness, for their emotional labor, for their patience, but not always for their full humanity. The healing begins when the empath starts to notice the mask without judgment, recognizing when they are performing understanding instead of expressing truth, when they are offering strength instead of admitting vulnerability. Jung believed that growth comes from integrating the persona with the authentic self rather than eliminating it, and this means learning to use the mask consciously instead of being controlled by it. As empaths begin to gently reveal more of their real thoughts, real limits, and real emotions, something powerful happens. The right people move closer, and the wrong people often move away. While this can feel frightening at first, it is also deeply clarifying. Relationships that survive authenticity tend to become more balanced, more honest, and more nourishing, while those built solely around the persona begin to fade. Over time, the empath starts to experience a different kind of connection, one that does not depend on constant emotional performance, but on mutual presence and genuine understanding. The exhaustion eases because they are no longer carrying the weight of being everything for everyone, and in its place grows a quieter, steadier sense of self. The persona no longer disappears, but it becomes flexible, a tool rather than a prison, allowing the empath to navigate the world while still honoring their inner truth. In this way, what once felt like a painful realization that they were loved for the mask rather than the self can become a turning point toward deeper authenticity, stronger boundaries, and a more honest, fulfilling emotional life. One of the most painful experiences for a super empath is not the moment they discover the truth, but the moment they realize they felt the truth long before it was ever confirmed and chose to ignore it anyway. Empaths often describe this as a quiet knowing, a subtle shift in energy, a strange discomfort in the body, or an emotional signal that something is not quite right, even when everything looks fine on the surface. This is emotional intuition, and it is one of the most powerful inner tools an empath possesses. Carl Jung believed that intuition is not random or irrational, but a form of deep psychological intelligence, a message rising from the unconscious where our true perceptions are formed before the mind can explain them. Yet many empaths learn, through experience and conditioning, to doubt this inner voice. They tell themselves they are overthinking, being too sensitive, imagining things, or being unfair. They override their instincts with logic, excuses, and hope. They choose to believe the story they want to believe rather than the truth they are sensing, especially when the emotional cost of acknowledging that truth feels too high. They stay because they love deeply, because they see potential, because they fear conflict, or because they do not want to appear mistrustful or difficult. In the beginning, this self-silencing can feel like kindness, like emotional maturity, like giving someone the benefit of the doubt, but over time it becomes a pattern of self-betrayal that quietly erodes trust in the self. Jung warned that when we ignore the messages of the unconscious, those messages do not disappear, they grow louder, often emerging as anxiety, restlessness, physical tension, or an unshakable feeling of unease that has no obvious explanation. Many empaths live with this discomfort for months or even years, sensing that something in their relationship, their environment, or their emotional dynamic is off, yet continuing to push that feeling aside because confronting it would require difficult conversations, painful decisions, or the possibility of loss. The breaking point usually does not come suddenly. It arrives slowly through a buildup of emotional strain until one day the truth becomes undeniable. Perhaps the dishonesty is revealed, the betrayal becomes clear, the emotional imbalance becomes impossible to ignore, or the empath simply feels emotionally exhausted beyond repair. When that moment arrives, it is rarely just sadness they feel, it is a deep, piercing regret that cuts through them. I knew this would happen. That realization is what makes the wound so lasting. The pain is no longer only about what someone else did, but about the awareness that the empath abandoned their own inner guidance again and again, even when it tried to protect them. Jung believed that intuition is one of the primary ways the psyche guides us toward wholeness, and when we consistently ignore it, we move further away from our authentic path. This is why empaths who have repeatedly overridden their intuition often feel lost, disconnected, or unsure of themselves, even when they are highly perceptive people. They begin to question their judgment, doubt their feelings, and mistrust their own perceptions, which creates a fragile inner foundation. The tragedy is that their intuition was never wrong, it was simply not honored. Healing begins when the empath slowly starts to rebuild trust in that inner voice, not by becoming suspicious of everyone, but by learning to take their own emotional signals seriously. They begin to notice the difference between anxiety and intuition, between fear-based stories and quiet inner knowing, and this awareness changes how they move through the world. They start to pause when something feels off. Instead of explaining it away, they allow themselves to ask difficult questions instead of staying silent, and they begin to recognize that protecting their emotional truth is not unkind, it is healthy. Over time, this shift restores a sense of inner stability that many empaths thought they had lost. Jung believed that when we listen to the unconscious, life begins to feel more aligned, more meaningful, and more coherent because we are no longer fighting against ourselves. The memory of past self-betrayal may never completely disappear, but it no longer feels like an open wound. Instead, it becomes a teacher. It reminds the empath of how deeply they can perceive, how wise their inner world truly is, and how important it is to never again abandon that quiet voice that was always trying to guide them towards safety, truth, and emotional integrity. One of the most heartbreaking patterns super empaths experience is not simply loving deeply, but loving an image they unknowingly created in their own mind. And this is where Carl Jung's concept of projection becomes so powerful and painfully accurate. Jung believed that when we do not fully recognize our own inner qualities, we often project them outward onto others, meaning we see in people what actually lives inside us. For empaths, this tendency is amplified because their emotional world is so rich, so nuanced, and so full of compassion that they naturally assume others carry the same depth. They notice small signs of vulnerability, fleeting moments of kindness, or hidden pain in someone, and instead of seeing these as just pieces of a complex personality, they build an entire story around them. They imagine who this person could become, how loving they could be if they healed, how kind they would be if they felt safe, how emotionally available they might become with enough patience and understanding. This imagined version often becomes more real in the empath's heart than the person standing in front of them. At first, this feels beautiful. It feels hopeful, meaningful, even spiritual, as though the empath is seeing the soul beneath the surface and believing in someone more deeply than anyone else ever has. But over time, cracks begin to appear. The behavior does not match the potential. The words do not align with the promises. The emotional reciprocity remains inconsistent or absent. Still, many empaths continue to hold on to the projected image because letting go of it feels like giving up on love itself. Jung explained that projection is powerful because it is unconscious. We do not realize we are doing it. The empath truly believes they are responding to the other person, when in reality they are responding to their own inner world reflected outward. This is why the eventual realization can be so devastating. When the truth becomes undeniable, when the pattern of behavior repeats one too many times, when the person shows clearly who they are through consistent action, the empath is not just grieving the relationship, they are grieving the dream they carried so carefully. The pain cuts deeply because it feels like waking up from a beautiful illusion into a harsh reality, and that contrast can be emotionally brutal. Many empaths describe this moment as feeling foolish, embarrassed, or deeply disappointed in themselves, even though the root of the experience is not naivety but emotional depth. They were not loving blindly, they were loving from a place of imagination, empathy, and inner richness. Jung would say that the qualities empaths fall in love with are often their own disowned qualities, their own capacity for devotion, growth, tenderness, and emotional honesty. The tragedy is that instead of recognizing these qualities as their own strength, they attribute them to others who may not actually possess them. This leads to relationships that feel unbalanced from the beginning, where the empath is constantly investing energy, understanding, and emotional labor, while the other person remains largely unchanged. Over time, this imbalance creates confusion, exhaustion, and a growing sense of emptiness. The empath begins to wonder why love feels so heavy, why connection feels one-sided, why they feel unseen despite giving so much. The answer often lies in the painful gap between who the other person is and who the empath believed they were. Healing begins when the empath slowly learns to separate perception from projection, to observe behavior rather than imagine potential, and to accept people as they consistently show themselves to be. This is not a cold or cynical process, it is a grounding one. It does not mean the empath becomes less compassionate, but rather that they become more discerning. They begin to understand that seeing potential is not a substitute for experiencing reality, and that love cannot be built on future promises, only on present truth. Jung believed that withdrawing projections is a key step in psychological growth because it allows us to reclaim our inner power. When empaths stop projecting their depth onto others, they begin to recognize that the beauty they were seeking has always existed within them. This realization can be bittersweet, but it is also empowering. Instead of feeling devastated by the loss of an illusion, they begin to feel rooted in themselves, less dependent on fantasy, and more capable of forming relationships that are based on genuine connection rather than imagined transformation. Over time, the pain of projection trauma becomes a source of wisdom. The empath learns to honor their emotional depth without giving it away prematurely, to appreciate their capacity for love without assuming others will match it, and to build connections grounded in truth rather than hope alone. What once felt like a cruel awakening slowly transforms into clarity, self-trust, and a deeper, more realistic form of love that protects the heart instead of breaking it. For many super empaths, loyalty is not just a value, it is an identity, and this is exactly why it can slowly turn from a beautiful strength into a quiet form of self-destruction. Empaths do not walk away easily. When they attach to someone, they attach deeply with sincerity, with patience, and with a genuine desire to understand rather than judge. They remember the good moments, the vulnerability they were shown, the promises that were spoken, and they hold onto those memories like anchors even when the present reality no longer supports them. This is why they often remain in relationships long after those connections have become emotionally draining, one-sided, or even harmful. They tell themselves that love requires endurance, that people go through difficult phases, that everyone deserves understanding, and that leaving would mean they have failed in some way. Carl Jung would describe this pattern as an unconscious repetition, a compulsion to replay emotional dynamics that have not yet been healed. Many empaths grew up in environments where they learned, subtly or openly, that love was something to be earned through patience, emotional labor, and self-sacrifice. They may have learned to become the peacemaker, the emotional support, the one who holds everything together, and as adults, they often carry this role straight into their closest relationships without even realizing it. So when a relationship begins to hurt, instead of seeing that pain as a signal to pause or step back, they see it as a challenge to try harder, to understand more deeply, to give even more. They excuse behavior that would be unacceptable to them if directed at someone else. They tolerate emotional distance, broken communication, inconsistency, and even disrespect because they are still emotionally loyal to the version of the person they first connected with. Over time, this loyalty becomes heavy. It stops feeling like devotion and starts feeling like obligation. They wake up tired, emotionally tense, constantly thinking about the relationship, constantly trying to fix what feels broken, while the other person often remains unchanged. Jung believed that when we do not become conscious of our patterns, we repeat them. And this is exactly what happens when empaths stay too long in painful dynamics. They are not staying because they are weak. They are staying because a part of them believes that endurance equals love and that walking away equals abandonment. The breaking point usually arrives quietly. It might be the moment they realize they are more anxious than peaceful, more drained than supported, more confused than secure. It might be when they notice that their emotional world revolves entirely around the other person's moods, needs, and availability. Or it might be when they finally see that all their effort has not created the change they hoped for. This realization hurts deeply, not only because of the loss of the relationship, but because of the time, energy, and emotional devotion that was poured into something that was never truly reciprocal. The regret that follows is often misunderstood. It is not regret for loving deeply, because empaths rarely regret their capacity for love. The real regret is staying beyond the point where their inner wisdom was already asking them to leave. It is the recognition that they ignored their own exhaustion, their own boundaries, their own quiet knowing, again and again, in the name of loyalty. Jung would say that this is the moment where unconscious patterns begin to surface into awareness, and although painful, it is also the doorway to growth. Once an empath sees the pattern clearly, they begin to question the beliefs that kept them trapped, the belief that love must be painful to be real, that endurance is proof of worth, that leaving means failure. Slowly, they begin to redefine loyalty, not as staying no matter the cost, but as staying true to themselves. They begin to understand that real love does not require self-abandonment, and that emotional connection should nourish rather than deplete. This shift does not happen overnight, but when it begins, it is powerful. The empath starts to honor their own emotional signals and to take their discomfort seriously and to recognize that walking away from what harms them is not cruelty, it is clarity. Over time, this awareness changes the kinds of relationships they enter, the boundaries they set, and the standards they hold. They still love deeply, but now they also protect their inner world. The pain of staying too long does not disappear completely, but it transforms into wisdom. It becomes the reminder that love should never require the loss of the self, and that the most meaningful loyalty an empath can ever offer is not to another person, but to their own emotional truth. There comes a quiet but powerful moment in the life of a super empath when something shifts inside, not dramatically, not with anger or bitterness, but with a clear, grounded awareness that they can no longer live in constant emotional self-sacrifice. And this is the beginning of what Carl Jung called individuation, the journey toward becoming whole. For a long time, the empath may have believed that their value came from how much they could give, how much they could understand, how much pain they could hold for others without complaint. They may have measured their worth by how needed they were, how available they were, how emotionally reliable they appeared, even when their inner world was exhausted. But healing begins the moment they start to question this pattern, the moment they realize that empathy without self-respect slowly erodes the soul. Jung believed that individuation is the process of integrating all parts of the self, including the vulnerable, the intuitive, the wounded, and the strong, into a coherent and authentic identity. For the empath, this means no longer pushing their own needs into the background for the sake of emotional harmony. It means learning to pause before responding to others, asking themselves how they truly feel instead of automatically tuning into everyone else. It means recognizing that their emotional energy is precious and not everyone is entitled to it. This shift can feel unfamiliar at first, even uncomfortable, because the empath has often built their identity around being the one who gives, the one who understands, the one who stays. Choosing self-respect can feel like selfishness in the beginning, especially for someone who has spent years prioritizing others, but over time it reveals itself as balance rather than selfishness. The evolved empath does not become cold or detached. They become clear. They still care deeply, but they are no longer driven by the unconscious need to rescue, fix, or prove their worth through emotional labor. They begin to set boundaries without excessive guilt, to say no without long explanations, and to walk away from emotional dynamics that feel draining instead of waiting until they are completely depleted. Jung believed that as we move toward wholeness, we stop living through our persona and begin living through our true self, and for the empath this often feels like coming home after a long period of inner exile. They start to trust their intuition again, to honor their emotional responses instead of questioning them, and to see their sensitivity not as a burden, but as a form of intelligence. This awakening changes the way they experience relationships. Instead of trying to be understood by everyone, they become more selective, more grounded, and more at peace with the idea that not everyone will resonate with their depth. They no longer chase emotional validation or overextend themselves to maintain connection. Instead, they cultivate relationships that feel mutual, respectful, and emotionally safe. This is not because they have hardened, but because they have become more aligned with who they truly are. The empath who has entered the process of individuation begins to experience a different quality of emotional life, one that feels quieter but stronger, less chaotic but more meaningful. There is less inner conflict, less self-doubt, less emotional whiplash, because they are no longer constantly negotiating between who they are and who they think they should be. They begin to feel grounded in their own presence, comfortable in their own emotional rhythms, and less dependent on external approval. Jung believed that the goal of psychological growth is not perfection but wholeness, and this is exactly what the awakened empath begins to embody. They still have moments of vulnerability, still feel deeply, still care intensely, but now these qualities exist within a solid sense of self rather than at the expense of it. Over time, this inner alignment transforms everything. Decisions become clearer, boundaries become more natural, and emotional experiences feel more integrated rather than overwhelming. The empath stops living reactively, constantly adjusting to others, and begins living intentionally, guided by their own values, intuition, and inner truth. What once felt like a painful journey of emotional loss and confusion becomes a meaningful path of self-discovery and growth. The awakening is not loud, but it is profound. It is the moment the empath realizes that their greatest responsibility was never to carry the emotional weight of others, but to honor the depth of their own inner world. And from that place of wholeness, their empathy no longer drains them. It becomes a strength that flows naturally, wisely, and with genuine emotional freedom.